let's go back in history to the 1930s, the Great Famine, where Stalin starved the Ukrainian peasants because he would not allow the farmers to plant as they knew best. Who knew better how to plant? The Ukrainian farmer. Well, he imposed his version of controls. He even had a so-called scientist, if you go back to Soviet scientists, that was not science at all, who said, oh, you can plant these plants closer together because, like all good socialists, they won't compete with one another. They'll cooperate with one another.
Do you want the truth? Are you tired of being so confused? You feel like you're more f***ed up than the lies on the evening news.
What is going on? Don't Unfriend Me. Matthew Speer from the Don't Unfriend Me show. I'm honored to have Michael McCarthy here today, who is the author of Noah Option. I'm going to allow Michael to kind of tell us a little bit about himself, where he resides, what are his life experiences, all those type of things that got him into writing literary works. And then, of course, I want to find out how you found the Don't Unfriend Me show. Of all the gin joints, why this one? Michael, welcome to the show, and I'll allow you to go ahead and talk a little bit about yourself.
I'm honored to be used in a Casablanca reference. Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Well, my name is Michael McCarthy, and I've been a management consultant and trainer most of my career, and I'm retired now. But back in 2008 or so, I feared for my country, and I know from my other readings that fiction is a good way to reach people through stories. Our Christian writer C.S. Lewis said stories are a good way to reach people. And more recently, Jordan Peterson, that Canadian psychologist, said that the human brain is hardwired to understand things in terms of stories and narratives. Of course, hence your show, and so forth. So I decided to write a fiction book to see if I could engage people in that way and tell some little parables, some fictional parables about what's going to happen to our country when the government controls everything. And of course, the sad thing is that so many of the things I predicted have already come true and are coming true at an accelerating pace under the Biden-Minchia regime. And thank you for your recent post about Joe has not had a cold for however many years. He's just being Joe.
It's just being Joe Biden. That's right. That's great. So the interesting to me is I always like to know the etymology of things. And when it comes to the Noah option, the title is what struck me. Is I think it's interesting. Is it that the book is focused on, we're going down a path of an extinction level event? Is it that there's prognostications of doom? Is it more biblical? Where did the title come from, and how did you come up with the Noah option?
Well, of course, the title comes from the story of Noah in the Bible, when there was going to be the flood to wipe out all of humanity, and God told Noah to gather his family and build an ark, and then save animals 2 by 2 to repopulate the earth after the flood. Well, I borrowed that metaphor for my book to say we are under a metaphorical flood of government control and regulations. They're wiping out the small business people and choking the nation's economy. And of course, we saw that during the COVID restrictions. There are so many small businesses and restaurants that still haven't fully come back from that because of all the restrictions and shutdowns that were put on them. And so I use the metaphor of Noah to say, in the plot of my book, groups of patriots gathered together to escape all this. And like the prepper movement, I found out about the prepper movement after I read the book, and I said, well, Noah was the first prepper.
Right.
Because he prepared for his family and prepared to save all the sorry,
go ahead. I apologize. I didn't interrupt. No, we have a little delay. My bad. Go ahead.
Okay. People gather into communities to try and protect themselves against this flood of regulation. And of course, the shortages that always ensue when the government totally controls everything and there are no free market signals to control the logistics and the flow of goods and services, you wind up like Soviet Russia with practically nothing on the shelves and the flow of goods gets shut down. So you better stockpile.
Yeah, I was just making a reference to Noah walking into a Home Depot and asking for pallets of gopher wood. I can't possibly imagine making the metaphor stick today, because people, obviously don't focus on the nuance as much as they should. But I love the comparison contrast. And Leroy, partner in crime here on the show, would absolutely love you. You made a reference to Jordan Peterson, number one, and then two, you want to talk about the economy. He's a geopolitical analyst for the military. He does a fantastic job and used to do what I still does what I used to do. So when we talk about this book and Dr. Grace Washington, she's identified as a beautiful botanist, which is interesting. I would love to kind of know about where you came up with the character. How does that happen? Do you build the character to go ahead and fit the story you have in mind, or do you kind of develop the story and then go ahead and build the characters? I'm interested to which comes first.
Well, I kind of built the the character. In many ways, my book is a retelling of the famous novel Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, except unlike Ayn Rand, who was a fierce atheist, I am a Christian and a believer in the good Lord. And so I wanted to use a different metaphor. She had people withdrawing into these communities. Well, the Gulch. I've renamed mine the Noah. I named them ARK communities after the metaphor of Noah. And I had my characters communicating on an internet domain called .ark for ARK, and communicating in that way. And so have always been annoyed by how the popular media assumes that all Black people, African Americans, are liberals, when there are so many famous Black conservatives, like one of our current Chief Justices. And due to that, I chose to make my two protagonists Black. And so we've got Dr. Grace Washington, who invents the seeds that can literally end world hunger. But of course, the big government types that want to reduce the population of the world don't want that to happen. They want to starve the population to reduce world population. And we've got Bill Gates and company and the World Economic Forum working on that type of plot against us. And then my other character, Isaiah Washington, is a entrepreneurial genius who invents software whereby small business people can do business through their cell phones. And of course, shortly after I came up with that, I've myself discovered the Square device and PayPal and so forth, these things. So some of my predictions came true there. It enabled, I could go to a book show and sell my own books with nothing but my cell phone with that software on it, and I could accept credit cards. So that enabled the small businessman to do business and flourish and let the economy flourish. So I had those two Black characters. And of course, the big corporations that are in bed with the government with the crony capitalism don't like to see that. They don't want a new upstart that's always disrupting. The new inventions are always disruptive by their nature. So they try to shut him down and put him on trial along with his love interest, Dr. Grace Washington. So they put her on trial. Well, guess what? Just like they put Trump on trial, when they can't shut you down with reason and arguments and good ideas, they just shut you down through force and coercion.
So when you talk about the supersedes, it's interesting. For instance, I think about the scientific factor of all of this is how do you balance something like, superseeds that have the ability to grow an abundance of crop or yield, that there has to be a little suspension of disbelief when it comes to that, because something like that doesn't exist right now. So how do you flirt with the more science fiction element of that, but also base it into reality as a predictive future?
Well, again, I take current trends and project them out. Now, my inspiration for that was the scientist Norman Borlaug, who I dedicate the book to, the father of the Green Revolution in Africa, India, and Asia. Mm-hmm. And my quote from Borlaug, he said, "Reach for the stars. Although you will never touch them, you may get a little stardust on your hands." The original Green Revolution back in the 70s that started feeding people in India and Africa due to his enhanced seeds that grew faster and resisted pests and so forth without the use of excessive pesticides and very many fertilizers. I just projected that out to say he's done it. So just what if that trend continues? So here's my scientist trying to do a good thing, feed hungry people, and yet she's persecuted for it.
Yeah, it's an interesting take. So one of the things that we talked about I'm not sure if you watched the show or not, or have watched the show. You found it, obviously.
I don't watch the show typically, but wherever you have something posted, like today, you had posted the text of what you had to say about Biden and his cold for 38-year-old cold.
Right. Okay, fair enough. So that's one of the things that some people, find to be interesting is that when I do these interviews, it's usually a discussion, and then I have a take, and then people are like, "Well, you're trying to interview me. Why are you talking?" And I said, "Well, because everyone does that, and it's boring. That's why we'd like to have a two-way conversation." So let me ask you this. When it comes to Russia and Ukraine, you have the number 1 and number 3 potash producer and fertilizer producing countries in the nation. There's obviously going to be an impact from Ukraine and Russia. We're already seeing that Africa is going to be the next hotbed, as similar as the Middle East was in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, how Eastern Europe and Western Europe, obviously in World War II, and then the South Pacific. And then you got to look at Asia when it comes to Vietnam and Korea, all hot spots. Africa in the next 20 to 30 years over that time period will be where the greatest superpowers are focused. Are you looking at this book as maybe a prognostication into that there is going to be world famine and hunger, maybe not for the United States and Russia and China, but obviously for the impoverished countries around the world? Have you been following that? You're aware of the fertilizer shortage. You're aware that 1 in 3 producing of wheat, Russia and Ukraine in this battle are not producing the yields that they have in the past. And this is going to have a huge impact. How do you foresee your book and kind of real world events, crossing the stream, so to speak? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the root cause, as usual, is government interference, whether it's in the form of the warfare or restricting the flow of fertilizer, because the big government types always think they know best. And these big government types are not agricultural experts. They are not people like the common farmer. You remember, let's go back in history to the 1930s, the great famine where Stalin starved the Ukrainian peasants because he would not allow the farmers to plant as they knew best. Who knew better how to plant? The Ukrainian farmer. Well, he imposed his version of controls. He even had a so-called scientist, if you go back to Soviet scientists, that was not science at all, who said, "Oh, you can plant these plants closer together because, like all good socialists, they won't compete with one another. They'll cooperate with one another." Now, right. I'm not a farmer, but even I know that if I plant my tomato plants too close together, one shades the other, and you don't get them to flourish and produce the tomatoes.
That's right. That's right.
That goes against common sense. And yet that was one of the major causes of the great famine in the 1930s in the Ukraine. And so again, when you have government actions, whether it's war, whether it's we're going to restrict the use of fertilizer or whatever, it doesn't end well. The farmers know best.
I think that's fair to say. It's interesting talking about China and obviously, socialism and the influence of Russia, and that the Maoists in the 70s, 80s, 90s in China would only allow a certain amount of yield from farmers. And they would overproduce their yield. It would actually go to the government free of charge. And every single farmer, no matter upon location or challenge of overall, how difficult it was to produce the yields that they would have to set the same exact price for everybody. And they were struggling. And there was a small village that went to the local leaders and said, "Listen, I'm not only going to produce what I do, but I'm going to produce an overabundance each quarter. And all I ask for you is to pay me for the same price that you would, and this village will grow and this village will prosper." And this was really the start of capitalism in Maoist China. And this is what got China out of some of the issues that they're having now with energy production and overall being able to export goods. So when you talk about government restrictions, when you talk about the government putting the thumb on the scale, so to speak, the book focuses on extremist groups and then, government capitalism, crony capitalism, kind of suppressing these great ideas that are coming. How do you correlate that to today's society? Why do you think government gets in the way and stops things like possibly different cures for cancer or different medications north of the border or south of the border that could help its citizens? Why do you think the government overregulates? Why do you think that they get involved as much as they do?
Just a naked lust for power. They want to be able to say, somebody who's in a position of power, very often the only way they can demonstrate that they have the power is to say no. Right. So whether it's a new way to combat the COVID virus, or whether it's a new way to cure cancer or whatever, all they can do, they're not scientists themselves, they're not biologists, they're not epidemiologists. All they can do is say no. So they exert that kind of control. Now, of course, the next thing that happens is the crony capitalism, where the big pharma companies see an aspect of, I can guarantee the sales of, for example, the COVID vaccine. Right. I can guarantee it when the government says everybody's got to be vaccinated, and we, the government, will pay for that. It's free. Such a deal. Well, of course, what we found out is that it's not a true vaccine, because people repeatedly get the virus over and over again, even if they've been vaccinated multiple times. Right. And so who benefits? It's the big pharma companies, as opposed to optional drugs and so forth. When you turn on your television set, or when I'm looking at my news feeds, there you see all these pharma ads for this and that type of thing. They're trying to persuade you, this will give you younger looking skin, or this will help you with your kidney problems or whatever. They've got to persuade you. Whereas with the COVID, they forced you. And that's so naturally, those pharma companies saved a heck of a lot on advertising dollars. They don't have to advertise any of the COVID vaccines because the government's going to force you. So they get in bed with the government. And of course, it's that revolving door that you know well about. The pharma executive gets placed on the FDA board or some cushy job on the FDA. And after they work that for a number of years, they go back and get rehired by the pharma company. So it becomes that revolving door of government to industry, industry to government, back and forth. And so they're in bed with one another, and there's a mutual profit that avoids the need of having a superior product that they've got to voluntarily convince us to buy. They force us to buy it. And of course, once you have that absence of market signals, there's no improvement. The other example I put in my notes here, if you remember back when Congress mandated that we all use those CFL bulbs, those little squirrely pigtail bulbs.
Yes,
because,
I do.
We had to save energy. And of course, it came out that mercury inside those bulbs, God forbid that you drop a bulb in your house and now you've got toxic mercury in your house. And they were forcing us all to buy that. And lo and behold, within a few years, the LED bulb came out. And Congress didn't have to mandate that I buy that. I wanted to buy it. The bulb lasts 10 years. The bulb cuts my electricity usage by some incredible percentage. So again, the free market always comes up with a better solution if you let it. But when the government tries to control it, it gets worse solutions in the starvation scenarios that you outlined earlier in these various countries.
It's a wonderful example, government intervention and, superseding their authority that nobody gave them. So it's an interesting thing. When I take a look at the characters of the book, did you have any influential writers that you follow? When I read the synopsis, and once again, I haven't read the book yet, I will absolutely do that and have you back on because I'll have 1,000 questions. It reminds me very much of Vince Flynn. And I don't know if you're a Vince Flynn character in the Mitch Rapp series, but Dr.
Yes,
Irene.
I loved his books.
Yeah, Dr. Irene Kennedy kind of strikes me as, maybe the main protagonist in your book as having a little bit of, subtle underlying tones. But who are your most influential writers and people who inspire you to do what you do?
Well, first of all, Ayn Rand with Atlas Shrugged, because she showed how when the government controls and regulates the economy too much, how the economy collapses. And so this was in some ways a rewrite of that, except instead of her hero, John Galt, I had my guy, Isaiah Mercury, the software genius guy in my book,
Hmm.
is the modern equivalent to her heroine, or excuse me, her heroes. So I paralleled that with little examples of, like, for example, there was a little scene in there where the Christian church was told they can't have a Sunday school anymore because it's illegal to teach religion. Well,
Hmm.
guess what? What did we see during COVID? They said, oh, all the churches have to shut down. You're not allowed to go to church because it might spread the virus. And yet the bars stayed open,
Right.
the big box stores stayed open. So again, the government is picking winners and losers, what you may or may not do. And so I just took that idea and projected it out. And by the way, one of my other intellectual heroes is the great black economist Thomas Sowell, who wrote the books on basic economics and others. And you might recall before he passed away, he used to have a weekly column in a lot of newspapers. And you know, economics is called the dismal science, but he made it so simple and common sense that anybody, even I, could understand it.
Right.
Um, and he showed, and the interesting thing about him is he started off as a Marxist,
Hmm.
but he had the virtue of intellectual honesty, whereas he looked at the Marxist examples, he saw that it didn't work. And in our own day, if you go all the way back to East and West Germany, East Germany wasn't working. Today, Venezuela isn't working. And of course, if you go to the NASA website, my favorite example, go to the NASA website and look up the satellite image of the night sky over the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, North and
And
South
the
Korea for
north
sure.
is all dark, the south is
Yep.
ablaze with light. Now,
Yep.
this is equivalent to what we all had in fifth grade science lessons to say you learn basic science where all the variables are the same except for one. You might take and plant a seed in a cup and water it and fertilize it and put it in the windowsill where it gets sunlight, and take the other plant, you water and fertilize it, but put it in the closet where it's dark. One flourishes, one does not. When you look at that image of North Korea being almost totally dark and South Korea being ablaze with light, you see the equivalent of a scientific experiment. You got the same ethnic group, Koreans, the same language, Korea, the same natural resources, the same everything except for one thing, the economic system and freedom. The South is free, the North is choked off by totalitarian central government control, and so they can't even feed their own people.
It's a great example of, once again, government getting involved. And I've seen those images, and we used to run satellite tasking over North and South Korea in the military. So we did it before it was okay. It's amazing the stuff that I see now that's available for human consumption that doesn't require security clearance. It's incredible.
Yes.
The stuff when I was in, I was like, you're not going to see a coastline, or you're not going to see a naval shipyard from Petropavlovsk or Severomorsk on the open internet, or if you do, you're going to go to Leavenworth. But now it's like the things that they show are incredible. Are there any sequels or future projects related to this that you're focused on? I kind of hate the question, because it's like, you're here to talk about the Noah's option, and now it's like, by the way, okay, now that you've got that, what else are you doing? But it's always good to pick people's brains and see if there's going to be a sequel, or is there another topic you want to encroach upon? So what's next in your writing agenda?
Glad you asked, because I did in fact create a sequel, The Rainbow Option. Now, I was advised not to use that title because it's been appropriated by what I call the alphabet people nowadays, LGBTQXYZ. But following the metaphor of Noah, that after the flood, the symbol of hope was the rainbow. So God
Right.
used it first before these alphabet people did. So
Sure.
I got
Sure.
stubborn and stuck with it. My sequel book was called The Rainbow Option, that showed after the government destroys the economy and destroys the United States of America, how do a group of patriots who banded together in these communities called art communities, they come out and rebuild a prosperous nation based on, and they have little separate nations, just like the United States started with little smaller groups of states, and rebuild a prosperous economy based on freedom and very limited government control. And then I followed up on that with a third book in my option series, as I called it, the no option, then the rainbow option, and the third one I called the Timshel option. And there I took the hypothetical that since the United States was, in my future scenario, had disintegrated, that a radical ISIS group took over New England and declared it to be the New England Caliphate and moved in with ISIS control and decreed that girls could not go to school anymore because, of course, in strict Islamic countries, girls can't go to school anymore.
Sharia law.
And so I created a third heroine, a young teenage girl named Christina, and she's told she can't go to school anymore, and she decides to fight back. So the Timshel option follows her adventures as she fights back against the oppression of this caliphate regime in the New England states.
So you picked New England. Minnesota would be more apropos because that's not too far from the truth, unfortunately.
True.
There's a lot of Somalian influence in that country, and as people know, hitting Donald Trump on the travel ban, when 93% of all world terrorism has some sort of tie to Somalia, you would think that Minnesota would be a primal hotspot for that. But so when you get feedback from readers, and what's great about Amazon is that if any of the listeners pick it up on Amazon, leave feedback. It's the most important thing. It's like a like and a share and a follow. It helps if somebody else can go ahead and you pass the proverbial baton, so to speak, to the next person. But have you received any feedback from readers that just really stands out to you? Something where someone told you and you're just like, oh, I didn't think of that, or, oh, wow, I didn't expect to have that impact, but that's a great outcome. And any stories, anecdotal stories that you want to share with us of feedback you've received from your readership?
Well, just one woman said that this should be required reading for all high school students. She was discovering as you well know, the abysmal ignorance where history isn't getting taught in a lot of schools today. American history isn't. And she used to run what she called a patriot camp in the summer to teach basic American history. And so when she read it, she said, oh, this ought to be required reading, because it makes the point that the founding principles of America, which are limited government, that government is restrained from doing things by the Constitution, is what has made us great, because it unleashed the entrepreneurial activity of every Tom, Dick, and Harry in the nation. You got to reap the rewards of your own sweat and toil. And that's why Americans have invented more new things, from the light bulb to the telephone to you name it, the internet, than any other nation, is because there's a reward to your effort. And then, of course, people say, oh, the big greedy guys like Bill Gates that made all the millions. Well, the real truth is most of them use that money they make to reinvest in the next generation. We had Windows 1 and then Windows 10 and then Windows 11. They reinvested on making improvements to their product. And who benefits? Me. I am told that I don't know if you remember the movie Apollo 13.
Yes, sir.
They had a scene in there where they showed mission control in Houston. And it was like a giant room as big as a high school gymnasium where there were just hundreds and hundreds of computer monitors and all these engineers staring at the computer monitors to guide the Apollo mission. I read somewhere, now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm just naively believing what I read, is that you and I possess in the palm of our hand. I can't get my cell phone to show up on the screen here, but
I got it.
possess in the palm of our hand more computing power than is in that entire room in mission control back at the time of Apollo 13. Now, if the government had been controlling the initial growth of the computer industry and software and the internet and all these things, it would probably be choked down to some very primitive state. But you and I are the beneficiaries of that. Here you can sit where I'm assuming you might be even sitting in your own home studio and broadcasting because of all these other people who've invented all these techniques and devices and software and so forth. We benefit from that.
Yeah.
So I don't begrudge these guys making a lot of money. They can, spend it on themselves, of course, but most of them reinvest it into new and greater ventures.
It's such an interesting conversation that I love it listening to people who can grasp the microcosm, who understand the minutia of things versus the complexity, because a lot of people just get caught up in the drudgery of just trying to explain a single thought. But it's such a great comparison contrast. The technology in our hands, it not only rivals the technology in the 1960s and what NASA possessed, but we eclipsed that a long time ago. In fact, it was a Texas Instrument calculator, which is the comparison that they made back then. As far as computing power, I want to put it in something in a larger perspective. 8 years ago, what you and I are doing was not possible.
Yeah, there you go.
It
it's
wasn't.
Constantly evolving and growing.
Yeah, I mean, we could connect over the phone, and there would be no delay with digital and fiber optic over the phone. But as far as video conferencing, we couldn't broadcast in this resolution in instantaneous sound transfer. 8 years ago, I had a podcast and we tried to accomplish this, and it was impossible. There was nothing you could do without satellite technology and broadcasting through satellites in order to get this speed of transfer. The interesting thing, though, is if you want to take it even in a broader context, 15 years ago, you could call Germany and you would still have a 3 to 5 second delay over the phone line. You could call Hawaii and the same thing would take place. Now it's instantaneous in real time. There is no delay. So to think about, we went from, the teletype and sending telegrams was the state of the art communication. And then obviously Alexander Graham Bell and the phone. And then, you move into using, satellite phones and these giant monstrosities. Does it shock you to see how far we've come in just in the last, 50, 60 years compared to when you were a boy? How like surreal is it? Is it because you're going through this in a kind of a slower process and growing generationally? Or can you sit back and look at this and say, I cannot believe where we are today. This is like Flash Gordon or the Jetsons to me. Or is it not that way?
If I had written a futuristic novel back in the 60s, it would have been like, it wouldn't have been this great with the cell phones and so forth. And like you say, even TV broadcast, when we see TV reporters reporting from the Middle East and they're doing the time delay. And like you say, I can call my daughter in South Korea on a FaceTime call for free, and there's no time delay. And that's 10 or 12,000 miles away. I don't know how they do it, but thank God there's all these engineers that work it out. I can make a free phone call. I'm benefiting from capitalism. That is free market capitalism. It's entrepreneurs, thinkers. One of the things I cited in some of the notes I sent to you is that the back to this issue about, we're world population, we're going to reach starvation because there are too many people on the planet. There was a recent book, and I was writing a review of it. It's called Super Abundance. And they've got what I like about them is they've got all the data in there and they've got graphs that show as the rate of world population increases, the rate of food and other material resources increases even faster. Right. And they cite that large screen, big screen TV that sold for like $1,400, to your point, 10 years ago, is now I can go down to Walmart and buy it for $147.
Yeah. Yeah.
So they always, all the leftists want to say, evil capitalism, it's just good for the rich. Hey, if I can buy a big screen TV that used to cost $14,000 for $147,
Right.
I'm the little guy. I'm the one who is benefiting.
That's
It's the
right.
rank and file people. It's not the big shots. So I'll take it.
This is such a great point. So the first DVD player I sold at Circuit City was $699.99. And the circuitry hasn't changed. It's just it's a small graphic processor with an audio out that reads with a laser eye and then disseminates that information into ones and zeros onto the screen, or progressively interlaced through an analog signal, depending upon which version you had. Not very complicated when we think about it now. Now, if you take it 40 years ago and I would have said any of those things, people would be looking at me like I'm ready for the booby hatch. But when you take a look at electronics and you'll take a look at vehicles, doesn't it baffle you that some things have gone up in price, like bread, like milk and eggs? Why is it that, and you know the answer, and I'm setting you up for a softball here. Why is it that you will see things like commodity go up in price with inflation, but other things go down when the technology becomes more refined, when it's easier to make the parts for the DVD player and they become an abundance, or the plastics or the metal pieces or the aluminum drilling is you can outsource it to multiple different places, which it references you with capitalism, which is the free market working, which drives the price down. Why is it that we have more acreage dedicated to wheat, we have more farms, more cows, more chickens than we've ever had before, but prices continue to go up? What's your thoughts on that?
Government, farm subsidies.
Yes.
The farmer is paid a certain amount, whether he's the more successful farmer or the less successful farmer. So he doesn't have to worry, like you and I, you got to worry about, are you getting enough advertisers to support your show? I've got to worry about, am I getting enough people buying my book to make it pay off? Well, they don't have to worry about that because they're getting these government subsidies from the tax money of you and I, thank you very much, which means they don't have to improve. So it's a fixed price for them, so there's no incentive to come up with a cheaper price. Whereas back to your example of the electronics, you remember the famous Moore's Law, where he predicted that the cost of a transistor would reduce an X amount doubling every, I can't remember the details now, every X number of years. And they've exceeded that to a great. So when there are no government interferences with the market signals, those people, Texas Instrument and others producing transistors, it was to their self-interest to innovate and find a cheaper, better, faster way to make a transistor, which makes us now have, to your point, I've got like a television studio right inside this little phone that I can put in my pocket.
Yes.
I can take videos and broadcast it and send it to you, whatever, and have like a studio in a box, so to speak, in my hip pocket. Because the government wasn't involved in regulating that and restricting the new innovations.
It's interesting that when you mentioned that, and we'll wrap up here, but when you look at technology like DVD, progressive 480p, and then they moved into 720p, which was HD, then you would go into like a UHD 1080p, and now it's 4K, and now 8K, and the 16K. It's interesting that the FCC does restrict that technology from coming out too soon, that they create a lifespan of product which is controlled. So for example, if you take a look at old 35 millimeter resolution, high definition was shot in the 70s. This is how they're bringing in Raiders of the Lost Ark and Star Wars and releasing it in a high definition because the technology wasn't there to process, but the focal lens and the camera capabilities were, but they just couldn't process it in massive scale to these movie theaters. So it's amazing how some things are restricted. And then you have to ask yourself the question, well, is that being done with medicine? Is that being done with a superseed technology or creating energy from cold fusion or water or whatever it would be? So here's the big, $100,000 pyramid question here. And yes, I look younger than I am. But the $100,000 Dick Clark question is this, is it doesn't have to be the New World Order. It doesn't have to be the WHO. It doesn't have to be Bill Gates. The only thing the government has to do is no longer recognize, which makes us a republic, the individual rights. When they sell collectivism, then it becomes a number. And it's okay if we lose 3-4 million people, because the individual rights and that singular person who the government is responsible for protecting, it doesn't necessarily matter when they look at it as a number and say, well, we still have 330 million. What does it really matter if we lose 10% of that? Is that the way you see our government going? Is they're becoming the fast food chain of governments, that they just don't necessarily care about the individual, they just only care about the bottom line?
Yes, just so. They look at us as a commodity. And I was just writing a piece today where COVID gave them the chance to expand government power, government services with the unemployment benefits and the welfare benefits and so forth. You got laid off on account of COVID. They put you on these unemployment, which is why restaurants today, I look at my hometown restaurants and they're only open 3 days a week. They can't get people to come back to work.
Right.
Well, this is not rocket science. If I say to you, hey, I've got a job, I'll pay you whatever, $300 a week to come in and be a cook here in the restaurant, or you can stay home and do nothing and I'll pay you $300 a week. Hey, it's a no-brainer. I'll take the job. It's easier. Stay home and get the same money. And so it's slowing down the economy and leading to the increased prices, like you said, of the commodities as well. Whenever government interferes in that, it's destroying the market signals that drive the innovation. Thank God they weren't controlling. When you look at the history of Bill Gates was tinkering around in a garage when he invented, his first software. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, they were tinkering around in a garage. Nothing fancy. They didn't have the big bucks. They were just playing around with stuff that they were in love with and loved to do that stuff. And when you set people free to pursue their own passions and interests, you get these new inventions, and who benefits? You and I. And if they make money doing it, that's great. It doesn't take anything away from me.
Besides reading the NOAA option, which everyone should do, and go to the NOAAoption.com, there is a book. There's a gentleman who I'm not a particular fan of, Walter Isaacson. His writing style is fine. He's just a sanctimonious, pompous jackass. Sorry, no offense. But Isaacson wrote an amazing book on jobs. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, please do. There's something that I think can sum up our conversation fairly well. And if you could, spare me a minute to tell you, and then we'll wrap up. And that was rhetorical. Sorry. I hate when people do that. I'm going to ask your permission, but I don't really care. I'm just going to do it anyway. It's talking about, yeah, well, yeah, but you're my honored guest. So Steve Jobs and his adoptive guardians were painting the inside of a fence, if you will. And they were, taking the time to make sure it was sanded, to make sure all the nail holes were set, they weren't protruding, and painted the inside of this fence. And I think it was San Jacinto or San Clemente or wherever, Silicon Valley, wherever they were at the point, maybe even outside of Cupertino, but it doesn't matter. And there was expansive farmland. And as you know, in California, the orange groves were just massive in California, and agriculture. And now it's all been leveled, and they've put these vertical MDU units in there for homes. But Steve Jobs was done with it, and, picking up the tarp and cleaning brushes. And his guardian just said to him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, we're done." And he goes, "No, we have the other side of the fence to do." And, Jobs as a young boy is like, "But it's open farmland. There's nobody for 20 miles. Nobody's going to see it." And he said to him, "We'll see it and we'll know." So when he built that Apple, prototype, which was really just a chipset, it was nothing in a box, and they're putting in the expanded RAM modules in there. Steve Jobs wanted a closed system. He didn't want it to be open. In fact, they used special screw key sets, which they still use in their phones and their items today because they don't want anyone cracking their product. Wozniak just said to him, "Hey man, what the hell we're putting in this RAM?" And Wozniak was putting it wherever it would fit. So some of them were at like a 37-degree angle, some were here, some were there. And it was just an amalgamation of just horrible, aesthetically non-pleasing. And Jobs is like, those all have to line up. Those three modules can't be all sporadic. And he's like, Steve, who cares? Like, who gives a crap? And he's like, I give a crap because I know it's there and it's got to be perfect. He's like, nobody's going to see it. And he's like, it doesn't matter. He's like, I've got 386 boards to solder within the next like 12 days. And that was Steve Jobs. And even though Steve Jobs never invented anything in his life, and even though Steve Jobs was a master manipulator and just ripped off everybody else's ideas, the one thing he was a great marketer. So the long question I have for you after that big lead up is that if you were to market your book for 1 minute and tell everyone why this is revolutionary or this will bring them into a different mindset, what is it about the Noah option that they have to participate in and have to read? And the 1 minute is yours to sell us on your title.
That the small guy can overcome the odds. That the true source of wealth is right up here between your ears. It is the mind. The economist Thomas Sowell said, we have got all the same natural resources that a caveman had. But what's different is over the hundreds of years, we have built upon other people's technology and have incremental improvements. And so whether it's Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or whoever, they're improving these transistors or whatever. It's all up here. People want to say, oh, it's the inequality or whatever. Well, once upon a time, there was no such thing as a cell phone. Once upon a time, there was no such thing as an iPhone. So you can't say, let's redistribute the wealth. Let's give everybody an iPhone. Well, in my lifetime, I can think back to when those things didn't even exist. There were none. So where did they come from? You don't grow them on trees. It's not like I can plant an iPhone tree like I can plant an apple tree. It's not a natural resource. It is a product of the mind. And the mind works best when it is free to experiment and dabble and try new things. And there's a lot of failures, as you well know, as you experiment with things. But the more you experiment, you're free to do this, the more likely you are to come up with that next breakthrough. So the big takeaway of my book is let the individuals not lose heart, even though there's this tsunami, as I called it, of this wave of government regulation drowning you. Keep working at it. Keep your mind free, because that's the source of all wealth and all improvement in this world is the human mind. And I call this Christian conservatives because my heroine and my hero are Christians. And when you say the mind is a thing, remember, we are made in the image of our Creator. And that's why we invent things, because our Creator invented the whole universe. So we're just mini creators. Now, as long as we realize that we're not God, yes, we create, but we can't create everything and we can't control everything. That was the sin of Satan, pride. I want to control everything. And you leave people free to tinker and invent, they can overcome these obstacles. Read the Noah option and you'll see examples of that.
Nobody has still rivaled or created the human eye. There are $30,000, $40,000 lenses out there, and the human eye is the greatest optical tool ever invented, and no one has ever been able to achieve it or scratch the surface. I want to thank you for coming. I hope that people get the book to kind of break the shackles of incremental growth and move to hyper growth. I think that is probably the testament to the entire conversation is we have a lot to make up for. I think we have had a very large gap in self-awareness and self-education in this country. And I hope that it begins for people with your book. That's at least what we try to do on this show. Whether we achieve that or not remains to be seen. Michael, thank you for coming. I told you when I first saw you, remind me of my father. After listening to you, it's very rare that I take a lot of interest in people's words anymore. But it's enlightening to have a human being with the brain power that you do. So thank you so much for being here. We'll have this cut and edited for you here within the next couple hours, and can't wait for you to see it live. And we look forward to talking to you again. So thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Adjusting transmitter output.
This is the Don't Unfriend Me Show with your hosts, Matt, Leroy, Amy, Olivia, and Mike. Geopolitics, military analysis, and election coverage. Coming to you live on the Spreely.tv network and all major social media channels at The DUM Show. Honest, direct, unfiltered. We can agree, we can disagree. Just don't unfriend me.